Today I'm going to talk about a um, brief guideline in terms of writing in the APA format. I would like to point out that um, this short lecture is for the benefit of my students who will be submitting their requirements at the end of the term. If you are viewing this um, for the purpose of learning the APA format, I guess you can also learn some things here. However, if you are not my student um, and you are preparing a manuscript for, let's say, for example, uh, a requirement for a course that you are taking, a methods course that you are taking, it would still be best to get information from your own instructor in terms of his or her own expectations with regard to your output. Um, but if you are my student, then this is a set of guidelines and a set of expectations in terms of um, what you will submit to me at the end of the term. I will also show you some template that you can use, and I will be giving this to you via our online learning management system. Okay, all right. Um, so to begin with, the general format for APA would be Times New Roman. That's the font, the ideal font. You can use Arial for purposes of describing your figure, which I will show later on. The ideal font size is font size 12. However, sometimes there might be a necessity to use smaller font size, especially for the content of the tables. Sometimes tables have a lot of content, and if you use font size 12, it will take up a lot of space. So in such cases, you might want to use a smaller font, simply for the purpose of allowing your table to fit in the page. 1 inch margin on all sides, double space all throughout, um, with the exception of table contents. So for tables, um, the the goal is to present a minimal looking table, and if we double space the content of the table, then you would have a very large table. So for contents within a table, single space would be sufficient, but otherwise all throughout the paper, double space is required. And then justified left. What I mean to say by justified left is that um, the left side is justified, while you allow while you don't do that on the right side of your paper. Okay, and then running head on all pages. So this is the running head. I will talk a bit about this later on, and also put page numbers on the upper right corner of every page. So I've set this as a header, so um, so that every page of your manuscript would have your running head and your page number. So those are the uh, general look of what an APA formatted manuscript looks like. Okay. So the first page is the title page. So in the title page, we expect to see of course, the title. So keep the title short as much as possible, no more than 12 words. Um, the title should also accurately express what the paper is about. Um, Here is an example. Um, so this is a sample manuscript. So the title of the manuscript is "The Impact of In-Group Favoritism on Self-Esteem: A Normative Perspective." The title already shows you what the variables are. From the title, you can already anticipate which is the independent variable, which is the dependent variable, and it seems that this relationship is specifically looked at uh, from a different perspective, which is the normative perspective. So norms also seem to be an important variable um, in this particular study. Okay, and then below the title is the name of the authors and the institutional affiliation. So so here is the template that I was talking about. So this is how your title page should look like. So here you put the title of your study and then the name of the authors. Um, the name of the author should appear as first name, middle initial, and last name. And then below is your institutional affiliation. Um, if you're a student, then that would be, of course, your school. If you're a teacher, then that would also be referred to your university. Um, Now, if there are multiple authors, what is the proper sequence of the authors? For some students, they arrange their names alphabetically, but ideally, the arrangement of the author names depend on the amount of contribution. So typically, the lead author, the one that has the most contribution to the paper, um, is the first author, and then whoever comes second would be the one which has the second most contribution, and so forth and so on. In some cases, this can also be done by arrangement. Sometimes there are certain senior faculty, for example, who are mentoring some students, and because they want to give their students more exposure, they're allowed their students to be the lead author. So in your case, if you're working in a group, so that would be an ideal scenario. Although I understand that sometimes you might you might find it difficult to determine who really is the one who is contributing the most. So I will leave it to you to decide on how you want to arrange your names, if you want to do it by contribution or you simply want to do it alphabetically. It doesn't really matter for the purpose of this requirement. And then for your running head, one of the things that you will notice is that how the running head looks in the first page is different from how the running head looks in the second page. So for the first page, you have here the word running head, and the running head specifically should be that the first letter of the word running is capitalized, and um, this is not capitalized, followed by a colon, and then your shortened title. Your shortened title should be short in the sense that it only occupies one line. Do not allow that there will be two lines for your shortened uh, title. Um, so in order for because the first page looks somewhat different uh, compared to the header in the second, and second page and so forth, there in the Word there is a way, there is an option for the first page um, of your paper to look different. So kindly explore that. um, okay, and make sure that the font for the page numbers and the running head is also Times New Roman. Okay, so the shortened title should still evoke the um, the essence of your actual title. It is important that at least the key variables are mentioned in your short title. Okay. And then after the title page, we have the abstract. So the abstract is a 150 to 250 word summary of your study. Um, and um, the general rule is be as straightforward as possible. There's no need to put background information in the abstract. I think you can go ahead and begin your first sentence with the objective of the study, and then maybe you want to talk a little bit about in aspects of the methodology, and if this is an abstract for a full paper, then talk a bit about the basic findings, and a short set of implications. So all of these should be contained in a 150 to 250 word summary. So the abstract is a single paragraph without paragraph indentions. So this is how your abstract should look like. So one paragraph, no indentions, justified left, do not justify the right portion. Okay, next, the actual body of the paper follows these major parts. So your introduction, which also includes, well, your short introduction, your literature review, your conceptual framework, the method part, which includes the research design, participants, instruments, data gathering procedure, and data analysis, the results, and the discussion, which partly can also include the conclusions of your study, and then finally your references and your appendices. Okay. So this is how so in the template that I will be giving you, I will also post a link in the description below. So I included some reminders that you can read within the template. The template serves two purposes. One, to give you sort of an idea of the format that I'm expecting, and second, if you read within this, there are also some instructions in terms of what I expect. So we've already talked about this a while ago. This part talks about what the content is. So this part is generally your short introduction for your paper. So in your short introduction, here are some of the things that you can discuss. By the way, this particular example is under the assumption that you're doing a quantitative quantitative study. um, so what I notice in many of the published materials is that um, the short introduction contains the following items. One, you can begin with a bit of a context or background of your study, just to somehow uh, humanize or allow your readers to uh, relate to the phenomenon that you are about to discuss. Second, you talk about the main phenomenon that you want to understand. Um, and then, third, you want to mention the theory that explains the phenomenon. Fourth, uh, you want to mention the gist of the recent findings about the phenomenon that you're interested in. Um, Next, you want to mention the limitations of these findings, essentially your research gap. Um, Next, a hint of what your research question is, followed by a hint of your prediction, and if it's still possible, a hint of uh, an explanation or prediction for your prediction rather. So all of these things that contains your short introduction um, can be done in a single paragraph. Here is an example. Okay. Um, so let me expand this. Okay. So uh, this part is a short introduction of this paper. So let me read to you, and then I'll try to point out what these things are in reference to the things that I have mentioned a while ago. Uh, these things. Okay. So the history of humanity. So again, this paper is about. Um, let's zoom out. This paper is about the impact of in-group favoritism on self-esteem, a normative perspective. Okay, um, so that means to say that um, people or when people favor their own in-group, that tends to raise their self-esteem. So that is the basic premise. If you favor your own in-group relative to an outgroup or the outgroup, that should raise your self-esteem. The logic is that when you favor your in-group, you're saying that your group is better than others. Hence, if you are a member of a better group, then you are a better person. Hence, you would perceive yourself in a higher regard. Okay, so let me read to you uh, the short introduction for this paper. The history of humanity abounds with situations in which people's interactions have been determined by the social category they belong to. Wars, Holocaust, and everyday discrimination are examples of depicting the hostile treatment that other people inflict upon others who do not belong to the same social group. So um, this part talks a bit about some context. So the author makes mention of wars and Holocaust and everyday discrimination as examples of the phenomenon that the author is interested in. Essentially, in-group favoritism is a form of discrimination if you favor your own group, and as a consequence treat members of the out group differently. That is a case of discrimination. So for in these two sentences, the author is communicating one, some context to allow us to relate to the phenomenon more, you know, mentioning historical things and everyday mundane things, and essentially he's also talking about the phenomenon that he wants to understand. Okay, next he says the dynamics regulating these intergroup relations are at the heart of social identity theory. So he's already mentioning the theory, or at least the initial theory from which tries to explain the phenomenon, which is the social identity theory. And this theory, according to him, remains to this day as a dominant approach in social psychology to explain such derogatory tendencies, the tendency for us to discriminate others on the basis of group membership, to favor our in group, and treat members of the out group differently. And then he continues to elaborate on what the theory is saying about this phenomenon. According to SIT, people have the fundamental need for positive self-esteem, which can be fulfilled through in-group favoritism. So I talked about this a little bit, when I said that when we favor our in-group, um, in essence, or that can result to a higher self-esteem, because favoring the in-group means that you are a member of a good group, and if you're a member of a good group, therefore you are a good person, and thus uh, um, you know you have more self-worth. So that is the basic premise. That is where uh, the researcher is coming from, in terms of theorizing about the phenomenon. And then I said that the next part should be a gist the of recent findings about this particular phenomenon. So the author says, however, mixed findings in the literature suggest that this link is not as straightforward as expected, and that further research is needed in order to fully understand the processes underlying this effect, if any. So the author is saying that while the theory says that um, in-group favoritism leads to positive self-esteem, that is the basic hypothesis um, drawn from the theory. When different studies have tested this hypothesis, the results have been mixed. What the author is saying is that sometimes, yes, that hypothesis has been evidenced. Sometimes it's not. And if you read the entire article, the author also pointed out that in some cases, self in-group favoritism did not actually lead to self-esteem. It lowered self-esteem. So that is your research gap, a summary of the findings and your research gap, which I mentioned, um, a while ago. And recent findings and the limitations, or the gap in these findings. And then the author goes on to talk about the objective of his study. So he says the present research investigates the moderating role of in-group norms. So he's introducing a new variable, and this is very a typical narrative for moderation. Moderation is typically used when there are inconsistent findings in the literature, and so logically, when there is an inconsistent um, finding for a hypothesis, you would think about why is there an inconsistency? If there is an inconsistency, can we identify conditions or situations when the hypothesis will be true and when the hypothesis will be untrue or would run the opposite direction? And this author is proposing an answer, and he is proposing that possibly the condition that identifies um, or that sorts out the inconsistency would be in-group norm. Um, right. So the present study investigates the moderating role of in-group norms regarding intergroup behavior, arguing that, so this is the, he's already discussing the hypothesis, arguing that in-group favoritism increases self-esteem to the extent that such behavior is congruent with one's in-group norms. So he's saying essentially that the relationship um, between um, in-group favoritism is self-esteem is only true when the norm of the group is congruent to in-group favoritism, meaning to say if the group um, if the norm of the group is to practice in-group favoritism, which goes along with, you know, discrimination of the out group, then in-group favoritism would lead to self-esteem. Otherwise, if the group is more accepting and does not really operate um, um, does not really encourage in-group favoritism, more accepting of others, in that situation, therefore, we should not expect in-group favoritism to lead to higher self-esteem. So essentially, he's already discussing the hypothesis. What is only missing here is a brief summary of the gist of the argumentation. But all in all, in this very short paragraph, the author has already uh, allowed the reader to get a glimpse of what the entire paper is about. Um, One thing to understand about the introduction is that oftentimes students simply write the background of their study in the introduction, but the introduction does not simply serve the purpose of laying down the context or the background. The introduction is called an introduction because it introduces the entire paper, and not only the background but the entire paper, including the phenomenon, the theory, the variables, the studies that have been conducted, the limitation of these studies, and um, uh, the objective of the study, and um, what the what the predictions are, what the hypotheses are, and even the justification for such hypothesis. Um, so that is what the introduction contains. Um, okay. And I think another mistake of students is that they write the introduction first without um, knowing what the content of the entire paper will be. It's very difficult to introduce something that you do not know. You cannot introduce someone that unless you have his or her curriculum vitae or resume. So my advice for you is that do not write the introduction unless you have already written most of your paper. At the very least, your literature review. Um, in essence, your introduction is a summary or a synthesis of your literature review. Um, there are two ways to look at this. Sometimes I would say that the literature review fleshes out the introduction because the introduction seems to be seems to be an outline of the things that will come ahead. So I sometimes would say that the literature review fleshes out the introduction, but um, in reality, it's not really fleshing out. In reality, what ideally happens is that you write your literature review first, and after you have written your literature review, then you have something to introduce. Okay. So again, my advice is write the introduction last. Do not write an introduction if you don't know what you are introducing. Um, all right. Next. Um, so the next part, well, I will talk about this later on. The next part is the literature review. Um, so after the short introduction, what it would appear like is that you're elaborating your ideas in the introduction. But again, like what I said, the literature review is not much of an elaboration of the introduction. It is more like that the introduction is a synthesis or a summary of your literature review. I think that's the better way of looking at the relationship between the two. um, and because the introduction is based on the review of literature, generally the outline of the introduction is the same as the outline of the literature review. Or I think the better way of saying it is that the outline of your literature review is practically the same as the outline of your introduction. Okay. So your literature review is basically serves the same purpose. Um, um, your literature review should allow your reader to understand what phenomenon you are um, trying to examine or understand, what theory um, what theory explains that phenomenon, um, what are the findings of um, of recent studies with regard to the phenomenon that you are interested in. After synthesizing these studies, what are the unanswered questions, or at least, well, not at least identify one unanswered question, one glaring research gap which you want to address. And after doing so, then you declare your objective, um, and then you you present a set of literature again that um, that gives you a hint of, or that can provide tentative answers for the objective of the research question. This might require um, a presentation of complementing theory, um, and after which you can present your hypothesis and synthesize your arguments for your hypothesis. Um, um, and your arguments for your hypothesis will typically be layered. Typically, the first layer of your arguments would be something theoretical, and then supplemented by another layer of arguments which is um, empirical in nature. So all of those things that I have said, are detailed here. Okay, so normally the literature review um, is presented in topics. So here are some examples. These are just examples. For example, you can have a section that theoretically describes the phenomenon, another section that discusses recent findings and their limitations, another that discusses and scaffolds your hypothesis, a section that discusses similar studies that seem to support your prediction, methodological limitations of these studies, um, uh, and then you know, discussing what you want to do, your objectives and your hypothesis. I think one typical mistake of students made is that when they make or when they partition their literature review in topics, they tend to make their topic sections per variable. Like they discuss one variable as one topic, another variable as another topic, and when you do that, you lose the narrative. The narrative is lost. Storytelling is very, very important in writing a manuscript. There really should be a good narrative, a storyline. It's pretty much the same as writing um, a novel. In essence, no? There should be an understandable storyline. And if you write your sections in a compartmentalized way, meaning to say that it's difficult to follow um, why you are discussing this particular section, what does this section have to do um, with the previous section, um, how does this particular section scaffolds or builds up your story in order to present the next section. If the readers do not see that, then it will be difficult to convey your paper and your ideas. So here is an example uh, of the narrative in this paper. So after presenting the introduction, you will notice that the sequence of the things that they discuss is practically the same, and you will notice that they're not discussing uh, variables. They're discussing, or their topic headers are very descriptive, and does not simply, talk about variables or defining variables. So they began again discussing social identity theory and the self-esteem hypothesis. Okay. So that's where they're coming from. They talked about in-group norm and in-group favoritism in order to build up the argument later on that in-group norm can potentially be a moderator between in-group favoritism and self-esteem. um, and then they talk about self-esteem, this time from a normative perspective. They will present here that the self-esteem hypothesis is not, or should not be taken as something that will always pan out, will always be consistently there, and that it will only be it will only manifest under certain conditions, and that is when the in-group norms is supportive of in-group favoritism, and then followed by uh, some empirical evidence to uh, what they are, the moderating, what they're trying to present, the moderating role of in-group, uh, of normative norms. And then later here they will also discuss the limitations of these studies, and from such limitations they now present what they plan to do. So that is the narrative, that is their storyline. So your literature review can conclude with this section, which is the current study. So the current study synthesizes everything that you have discussed, and in the current study, that's where essentially we present, the objective of our study, what our predictions are, um, and our arguments and justification for our prediction. Okay. So after having written your literature review, that might be a good time to write your introduction, because now you have something to introduce. Okay. Now, while we are all doing this, I want to talk a bit about how the level headings look like. Um, the parts of your manuscript um, is a hierarchy of things. For example, the literature review is within the general section of the uh, conceptualization of your paper. Certainly, the method section is another major section, and within the method section, we have the research design, participants, instruments. Within the instruments, we have the first instrument, the second instrument. Um, okay, so it's a hierarchy of things, and you will notice that the format for this is a level heading. The format for this level heading is different from a format for this level heading, and is different for this level heading. Um, so I identify, or we are identifying this as a first level, a second level heading, and a third level heading. Okay. um, and what are the format for these level headings? So the format is as such. For level 1, it's centered, boldface, uppercase, and lowercase headings. Okay. um, with the exemption of, for some reason, with the exemption of your title page, which is uppercase and lowercase heading, centered but not boldface, with the exemption of that. Methods, that is boldface. Okay. All right. Second level is left aligned, boldface, uppercase, and lowercase heading, such as this one. This is a second level heading, left aligned, uppercase, lowercase, boldface. This is a second level heading as well. Third level is indented, boldface, lowercase heading with a period, and then afterwards begin the body text. So this is an example. So this, the name of the, well, don't write the name of the first instrument. Write the actual name of the first instrument. Indented, lowercase headings, except of course for the first letter, and if there are proper nouns, and with a period, and then the body of that particular section. Okay. So, all right. Now, as you are writing your literature review, of course, you build your literature review from materials that you have read from your from the literature, and that would require us to cite our sources, cite authors that we have read. So here are some general guidelines on how to do in-text citation. So one, as much as possible, paraphrase and avoid direct quotation. Um, it is important that you understand what paraphrasing means, and if you think you are not skilled enough in terms of paraphrasing, I think that this is something that you also have to look into. What are the best practices in terms of paraphrasing ideas, and like what we said, we avoid direct quotations. If we want to quote verbatim from our sources, um, this is only done when paraphrasing is not the best option, and it is not the best option when you think that paraphrasing some of the ideas would lead to an important loss of information. we paraphrase, I guess, when we define certain things. If you think that um, you cannot define in a paraphrased manner some of the variables, and or if you think that paraphrasing would not really capture accurately the definition, then under those circumstances we can directly quote. But for the most part, we have to paraphrase. Um, Next, um, here are some guidelines in terms of the format for in-text citation. There are certain variations when when you perform in-text citation, depending on the number of authors, and when you mention this source, are you mentioning them for the first time, or are you mentioning them um, for the second or third time? So for single author, um, here are some examples. You can say that non-traditional students return to school for utilitarian purposes, and then do your in-text citation by mentioning the author and the date of the year of the publication within a parenthesis. Or you can say this: Nob suggested that non-traditional students return to school for utilitarian purposes. And in this case, wherein the name of the author is already part of the sentence, uh, then the only information that you have to put in the parenthesis is the year of the publication. Um, my suggestion, however, is avoid doing this. Avoid including the author's name in the actual structure of the sentence. Many scholars prefer this manner of in-text citation than this. We only do this sparingly. Um, for example, if there are certain debate in um, the literature, and you want to emphasize who said what, then maybe this would be an option. But as a general rule, this is much better. Um, Based on my experience, students typically um, use in-text citation in this manner. It's very often that students would say according to this author, or according to that author, or based on this study, according to this study, which is not really a good way of telling your story. I think that it 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 begins to sound like a gossip, and um, it kind of communicates that you're sort of distant to your own narrative, that you did not really read or understand what you have read, and so you want to put the weight of the responsibility in terms of ideas to the original author. Well, that's just my how I perceive it, in a personal way. So um, as a general rule, avoid this kind of citation. This is a much preferred way of mentioning your sources. It doesn't kill off your narrative. Um, you talk as though that you understand really what the idea is, and that you're using that idea simply to fulfill the narrative that you are presenting. Okay. And then for the succeeding mentions, it's practically the same. Um, Now, if there are two authors, so this is how you do it. The only variation is that if the authors are part of the sentence structure, then you use the word "and." But if it is in a parenthesis, which is ideal, you use ampersand. Okay. And then second mention, same same rule. Okay. Now, um, when you have 3 to 5 authors, however, there will be a variation between the first mention and the succeeding mention. So same rule, if the authors are part of the sentence structure, use the word. If they are in the parentheses, use this instead. So in the first mention, you mention all the authors. In the second mention, or in the succeeding mention of these sources, you only mention the first author followed by et al. And then the year of publication. Um, there are oftentimes students use this kind of citation even if it's the first mention, um, probably because they are simply relying on, or probably because um, um, they're simply citing authors based on how the citation appears in the literature review that they are reading. um, but the proper way to do it is to mention all of the authors in the first time that you mention it, and for the next for the succeeding occasions wherein you mention it, then use this particular format. And finally, if you have 6 or more authors, um, then even for the first mention, you use this instead of mentioning all of the authors, and that goes for the rest of your citations. Okay. So that's some suggestions for in-text citation. Um, Now, sometimes we cannot really source the actual reference. We have read a material cited by somebody. We like the idea. We think it's a key piece in our narrative. Unfortunately, the paper that we read is that of Cleophas, and we cannot find the original paper by Nob. So this is how you cite it. So Nob as cited in Cleophas 2013. But as much as possible, we want to avoid this. As much as possible, we want to find the original uh, article by Nob and cite directly Nob instead of doing this. That also avoids the further decay in the information. Um, this idea has already been paraphrased by Cleophas, and if you paraphrase it for a second time, um, that might lead to the the loss of the actual essence of what Nob is trying to say. So as much as possible, look for the original material, read that material, understand what Nob is saying, and then cite Nob directly. Okay. Next, for if you need to quote, then this is how you quote. So you quote in verbatim, a definition or an idea, and then you cite the the author, and what you include aside from the name and the year is the page number from which you got the quotation. The page number always should be found at the end of the sentence. So even in this case, uh, the citation of the name of the author and the year is in the beginning of the sentence, but the page is still found at the end of the sentence. If you are quoting more than 40 words, then you do a block quotation. So here is an example of a block quotation. So you will notice that they are the margin for this block is bigger, um, and you would also notice that the font is sometimes smaller in published material. So this is an example of a block quotation. If I'm not mistaken, you can only do this for materials that are less than 500 words. Anything more than 500 words, you need to um, have a written permission that you can use that particular section of the article. Okay. Um, so let's continue with the template. So we are done with the literature review. The next section would be the method section. The method section. So you can begin with an introductory paragraph. Just tell the reader what they should expect in this section, and in this um, part, you will discuss what your research design is. Um, so if it's an experiment, and then describe what that research design is, explain why that research design is most appropriate for your paper, for your study. If it is an experimental research design, some examples would be between subjects design, within subjects design, factorial design. If you're doing qualitative study, then this might be grounded theory, interpretative phenomenological analysis, um, uh, consensual qualitative research, descriptive qualitative. I specifically mentioned here non-experimental studies because many students conduct non-experimental studies, and my personal preference for research design that are non-experimental is the classification by Bert Johnson. So you can find his paper. Um, I will try to put a link below for this particular source. He has a good taxonomy of non-experimental designs. So personally, I do not encourage my students uh, to refer to their designs as correlational research or um, causal comparative research, which are terminologies from older textbooks. I would much rather they use the taxonomy of Johnson. For example, cross-sectional, predictive, non-experimental, quantitative research design. That is one of his 9 classifications of non-experimental designs. So I highly suggest this particular source. And then the participants. So you talk about who the participants are, how many they are, how were they sampled, what is the sampling technique, is this convenient sampling, um, um, if they were selected purposively, what was the criteria for selecting the sample, and then describe key characteristics such as what is their age, percentage of males, females, and other relevant demographic information. Okay. All right. Next would be the research instrument. So you can also begin with an introductory paragraph, and then a description of your instrument. So put here the actual name of your instrument, of your scale, describe it. So here are some of the things that you need to discuss. What variables does it measure? What does it contain? How many items? Why will it be used? How will it be answered? What is the response format? You can also provide sample items, um, and then if available, it's best to discuss some of the validity and reliability measures or psychometric properties. And then if you have other scales, then you can also put it here. um, if your scale is, by the way, the example I'm showing is in reference to a quantitative study. I have another uh, I have another uh, template, and this one is for qualitative studies. So there will be slight variations. So for example here, I guess your instrument would be, let's say for example, an interview guide. So yeah, so this is what you can put in the description of that particular instrument. Okay. um, okay, and then second to the last, the data gathering procedures. What you want to put in the data gathering procedure are details in terms of how you collected the data. I guess the best gauge, if you're doing it, if you want to know if you're doing it right, is that ask yourself, if somebody reads this section, can he do what I exactly did for my study? If you think that the reader can sufficiently replicate your study, then you have succeeded in presenting a well detailed data gathering procedure. And then finally, um, the data analysis. Some students confuse this as the results section. Some of my students put in the data analysis the actual analysis of, or the results of their analysis. The data analysis simply talks about what statistical techniques did you use and why are you using these techniques. So these techniques can range from descriptive statistics to inferential statistics to post hoc analysis. So discuss them in detail. What are they, and why are you discussing them? Why are you using them, rather? For what purpose? All right. Okay. Next would be the result section. Um, so the result section basically contains the summary of your analyzed data. Remember that the results section serves the purpose of answering your research question, so it is important that you are completely aware of the questions that you raised. And if there is a hypothesis for for quantitative studies, the results section serves to verify, well, not verify, but present supporting evidence or contradicting evidence to the tentative answers that you have forwarded in your conceptualization, which is basically your hypothesis. Um, all right. Um, so generally, the sequence of things uh, can be as such. First, you can present your descriptive analysis. Um, for example, you can present bivariate correlations first, or the means and standard deviations of your measures. Um, what you should avoid, however, is sometimes students have the tendency to present uh, statistics about the demographics, age, um, um, percentage of males and females. You don't have to put that in the results section. That should be placed in the description of the participants. Okay. All right. Um, what else? Uh, And then afterwards, you can proceed with your inferential results. So these are uh, the result of the analysis that is intended to test your hypothesis. Okay. Um, Other reminders, so organize the presentation of the results in such a way that you are answering the research questions. Do not simply copy and paste tables from your software. There is a proper way of formatting these tables, and I suggest that you take a look at the APA manual for publication for the format of these tables and figures. Um, it is also recommended that you can take a look at studies that have made use of similar analysis, and you can also try to imitate their style of presenting their tables. Um, so here is an example of an APA formatted table. So this is a um, zero order correlation matrix. Some things that you need to remember is that table 1 appears here, and then double space the title of the table. The title of the table is italicized, as you can see, and then capitalize the major words, or the first words, or the first letter of the major words. um, Table 1 is not italicized. Nothing is in boldface. Um, and what else? So use sequential Arabic numerals for table numbers, and as a reminder, there are no such thing as table 1.1, table 1.2 in APA format. It's just table 1, table 2, table 3, so on and so forth. Um, you might also illustrate some figures in your results. So this is the format for the figure. So you put your illustration, and then the title. Well, you really don't put a title in the really don't put a title for the figure. um, the word figure, and then whatever figure number that is in italics, and then what you put afterwards is not really the title, but a description of what the figure is about. Again, this should not be a figure title. This is a description of what the figure is. Okay, sorry. Okay, and then finally, the last part would be the discussion part. So here are some tips. You may begin by reminding the reader of the objective of your study. Um, oh, by the way, before I forget, um, in describing the results, make sure that you follow convention on how to describe your tables. I've talked a bit about this in my other videos on how to write report for some analysis. You can visit those videos for some guidelines or suggestions on how to write the result section. So going back, in the discussion, you can begin by reminding the reader of the objectives of your study, your research problem, um, and then you elaborate what you found uh, uh, by evaluating and interpreting the implications with respect to your hypothesis. So did the results provide support for the hypothesis? If they did, then elaborate on the theoretical explanation. This shouldn't be very hard to do because all of these argumentations are found in your literature review and conceptual framework. You may also want to find or you may also want to present alternative explanations, but for the purpose of arguing that your theoretical explanation is um, a more logical one. um, but what do we do when our hypotheses are not supported? This happens very often, more often than you think. um, if our if the results of our analysis does not support our hypothesis, then we should think about what are why that is so. We have to offer possible alternative explanations, and these explanations should also be layered. These explanations should not be based on um, based on your personal opinion, and that means to say that you need to go back to your literature and find additional literature that you think can explain why your analysis or why the result of your analysis did not support your hypothesis. So you'll be needing additional literature for this. Um, the reason might also be methodological, but be cautious when you do so. Ideally, um, you have planned well. So ideally, there shouldn't be any methodological problem. But if there are methodological issues, then I guess you should be honest about what those methodological issues are. Um, you may also argue from the angle that um, your study is different from other studies, and maybe that could bring forth some inspiration in terms of what future researchers might do about the same topic. And then finally, we discuss the implication of your study in terms of theory. So, what does your study contribute to the theory? Did you find out something new? Does your result strengthen an existing theory? Does your result makes us want to question such existing theory? And also, if there are practical implications, it would also be nice. Based on what you've learned, how do you think this can contribute to psychological practice, or the practice of education, or the practice of um, human resources, or whatever context you think your findings have uh, applications to. Um, you also want to discuss the possible limitations of the things that you have learned, and from these limitations, you can now make recommendations for future researchers on what they can do. As much as possible, try to be generous in terms of giving recommendations for future researchers. If it's possible, if you have certain ideas in mind in terms of what they can do exactly, or what hypothesis they might test, those are also things that you can share with them. All right. So for the most part, I've been talking about this template, and as I what I have said, this template is uh, for a quantitative paper. Um, Here is the template. If your paper is qualitative, there will be certain variations. One, of course, is that for qualitative paper, we are typically not expected to forward hypothesis. There are some qualitative research, however, that does require that. For example, there are some case study methods that encourages researchers to uh, put forward a hypothesis. But for the most part, many qualitative studies do not require that. Some qualitative studies might also be um, ground up in the sense that they really do not um, they're not interested in um, theories, or perhaps the phenomena that you're interested in is very novel, that existing theories do not exist. So the role of theory in qualitative research perhaps would be um, more limited, relative to the role of theory, which is very important in quantitative uh, post-positivistic research. Um, there will also be a difference in terms of what you present in the results section. For example, if what you're doing is thematic analysis, then instead of tables, you present the themes. And as what I've said before, the important thing in presenting your result is that you are fully aware of the research questions that you have posed, and that if your answers are in the form of themes, it is important that these themes really are answering the question that you have raised. So, if it's the result of a thematic analysis, you can begin by discussing what the theme is, describe it, um, and then you can provide some excerpts as evidence of that theme, and then elaborate what the excerpt demonstrates in relation to the theme. Um, Okay. Uh, if there is also a need to relate the themes with one another, you can also do that. Okay. Let's see if I can pull up uh, pull out an example. Um, okay. So let's see. All right. So here is. So this is a paper about decision making in planned lesbian parenting, an interpretative phenomenological analysis, which is a popular qualitative research design. So let me just show you how they presented their themes. So they started with some background information about the participants. The question is, what is the question? I think the question is, what are the factors that they consider when deciding to have a child? Lesbian couples. So here's an example. Yeah. So they mention the theme. They describe the theme. Um, and then they write a short narrative that leads to the excerpt that um, is evidence for the theme, and then within this, now there are certain elaborations and explanation as to what the excerpt mean, in of course in reference to the research question that they are trying to answer. Right, so here's another theme. Okay, excerpt, and then these are the elaborations. Okay. All right. And then finally, references. So I will not talk about this much. Just be very particular with the formatting for the reference section. there are a lot of available resources online that you can take a look at if you're not sure on how to format your references. Okay. All right, so that's it, I guess. This has been a rather lengthy lecture. I hope that you have been patient. I apologize if I speak too fast. I didn't want to make this lecture too long, but as it ends out, it's gonna be a long lecture. So I hope that you've learned something from this supposed short lecture, which turned out into a full-blown lecture. And if you have some questions, just you may ask them in the comment section, and I'll try to answer them. So I hope you learned something today, and I'll see you in the next video.